We can get started. Thank you again for everybody who's coming out tonight to see this presentation and provide your input about the environmental review process for the R3 zoning district update. As a reminder, this is the scoping meeting for that process. This is a required part of the California Environmental Quality Act. As we'll talk more in this meeting, the purpose of this meeting is to hear from the community about issues that should be addressed in the environmental review process. So we're going to start with a presentation, and then we'll get into your questions and comments. The meeting tonight is going to have an introduction, description of the R3 zoning district update and what it will include. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what is CEQA and what is scoping. And then we'll talk about schedule and next steps, how to submit comments, and then we'll have your opportunity for questions and comments. I am Eric Anderson. I'm the planning manager for long-range planning for the city of Mountain View, and I'm managing this project. I'm also joined by the project manager for Opticos, who is our code consultant on this project. They're helping us to draft the code and provide best practices and other consultant expertise on this project. And then we have our environmental consultant, Gianna Meschi. She's the project manager for Rincon Consultants, and they are taking the lead on all aspects of CEQA compliance. So thank you to Gianna and Cecilia for joining. So basic introduction, CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, requires the city to hold this meeting regarding this project. And the purpose of scoping, as I said earlier, is to identify environmental issues related to a project before we actually start getting into the full drafting of the EIR. Scoping can also identify possible alternatives or mitigation measures that could avoid potentially significant environmental effects. So this project has been developed over the past several years. The council provided direction on the kind of land use direction for this project at a meeting in March 25th, as well as a more recent meeting on June 24th. Fundamentally, the project is an update to the R3 zoning district, which is the primary multifamily housing zoning district in the city. You can see it in orange on this map, but it also affects a few of the gray areas on the maps. Those are precise plans that may reference the R3 zone. It's going to increase allowable density in specific areas that I'll talk about in a minute. We're going to update development standards to address kind of modern building types and to generally make projects buildable at allowed densities. And then the council has directed us to allow neighborhood commercial. And so we'll be having more conversations with council about the extent of neighborhood serving commercial, but that is also going to be a part of this project. There will also be associated general plan amendments because we are changing densities in the R3 zone. And we're also integrating various housing element implementation programs. The housing element was adopted by the city and certified by the state in 2023. It includes several projects, several programs that have overlap with this project. One of which is to take areas that are zoned R2. And on this map, those are kind of the darker yellow areas. And either allow the types of development that would be permitted in R1 under SB 9, so up to 4 units, plus additional ADUs, or to upzone into the R3 zone. And we'll talk about where council has directed us to do that. We also need to draft local zoning language to implement various state laws that have been adopted over the last few years. And then, of course, another housing element implementation item is to update standards for non-conforming densities, especially in the R1 and R2 zone, to allow longer life for multifamily buildings in those zones, or also potentially to allow reconstruction of those buildings. Fundamentally, this project could result in up to 10,000 to 16,000 new units across the city. There is a large potential for change with this project, given the densities that are being contemplated in this EIR. So focusing in on the R3 zone and the different densities that the R3 zone will contemplate, Council has already directed us to look at 5 different density levels. And you can see those in the far right column here, ranging from about 15 to 20 units to about 75 to 110 units per acre. And then on the map on the left, you can see where those different zones are going to apply. The darkest reddest areas are the highest densities, 75 to 110 units per acre. I apologize for the typo in the map. That should be 75 to 110. The table is correct. And then the kind of medium red is 50 to 75 units per acre. And again, that's an upper range. That's not a range of minimum to maximum density. We still have more analysis that we need to do to identify what the actual maximum density is going to be, but it will be somewhere in that range. R3B and R3C are areas of stability in the R3 zone. They are not increasing densities. The existing general plan density of 25 units per acre will continue to apply in the R3B areas, and the existing general plan density of 35 units per acre will continue to apply in the R3C areas. And then, of course, in the table here, you can see the relative acreage of these areas. So I can provide any more detail about the densification program if you have any questions at the end of the presentation. We are also considering during this project to take existing city parks, and because of limits under state law, we cannot rezone them from residential to parkland. So because we have this opportunity where we're increasing density pretty significantly across the city, we can do some targeted rezonings to existing city parks to rezone them to public facilities or our typical parkland zoning district. Again, these are existing city parks, no new public property or anything else is being identified through this process. It's more of an administrative code cleanup that we can do now because we're upzoning. I'm going to hand it over to Gianna to carry out the rest of the presentation. Thank you, Gianna.
Thank you, Eric. All right, so hi everybody. As Eric introduced me, my name is Gianna. I'm with Rincon Consultants, and I am the project manager for the environmental review side of the R3 project. So right now I just wanted to give a little bit of background about the environmental review process, explain the purpose behind this particular meeting, and then briefly outline the anticipated scope of the document. So the reason we are doing this analysis is because of the California Environmental Quality Act, or as I will refer to it, CEQA. It was passed in 1970, and at its core is really all about public disclosure and input. So it requires that we analyze the environmental impacts of a project and then take those into consideration before we actually make a decision on a project. So we do that through preparing environmental review documents, including environmental impact reports, or EIRs, which is what we are doing here. So to start this process, the city determined that a program EIR would be necessary to evaluate the impacts of the project. And as a programmatic document, this EIR will present a citywide assessment of the impacts of the R3 project. So accordingly, that's an analysis that is pretty high level. It's not going to look at site-specific impacts of individual projects. That won't be required or analyzed within this EIR. Rather, the intent of this approach is to enable development facilitated by the R3 project in the future to use streamlining and tiering opportunities set forth by the CEQA guidelines for future CEQA compliance. The draft EIR also serves to provide an avenue for analyzing the impacts of the project and then disclosing those to the public. It seeks to minimize, reduce, or avoid some significant environmental impacts. And then lastly, CEQA provides the lead agency with a program to monitor and report mitigation measures to ensure that the project actually reduces the impacts accordingly. And that usually takes the form of a detailed table of requirements and then who is responsible for seeing them out. Next slide, Eric. Alrighty. So I included this little flow chart because I thought it would be helpful to kind of visualize the CEQA process from top to bottom. So as you can see from it, we are really at the beginning of the process. And at this point, we are soliciting input from the public on the draft EIR before we really begin preparing and analyzing. So looking forward, our next step is going to actually be to prepare the draft EIR and then publish it, which opens up a 45-day draft EIR review period, during which we would solicit comments on the adequacy of the draft EIR. Next slide, Eric. So what is scoping and what is the purpose of this meeting today? So this is really an opportunity to introduce the EIR to the public and then solicit input on the issues of concern with regards to the environmental impact of the project. So scoping invites public input on the environmental analysis that will be conducted and can suggest topic areas to address, identify issues of concern, suggest potential alternatives to the project, and even propose mitigation measures. So again, it's really the start of the public input process, but I do want to highlight this meeting is not your only avenue to provide input on the EIR or to submit comments, which I will cover later in the presentation. Next slide, Eric. So CEQA requires an analysis of 20 separate issue areas, which are listed on this slide. So looking at the environmental analysis, the draft EIR will study these resource areas as required by CEQA. And as you can see on the slide, these range from looking at the project's impacts to aesthetics, to geology and soils, to noise, to public service. It's a pretty broad range of topics that we'll be covering. Next slide. So once the draft EIR is actually available and on the streets for you to view, it will follow the structure shown here. There will be an introduction and an executive summary, which is a really great place to look to get a snapshot of the issue areas, the impacts of the projects, and any mitigation measures that we've required. There will also be a detailed project description, which breaks down the characteristics of the project and what all it sets out to do. But the bulk of the EIR analysis is the actual environmental impact analysis. So for each of the issue areas I mentioned on the previous slide, we will have a standalone chapter, which includes a setting section, which lays out the physical, environmental, and regulations that are relevant to that issue area. And then each section will also include an analysis of the project's impacts. So the potential project impacts will be compared to thresholds of significance in order to determine the nature and the severity of any direct or indirect impacts of the project. In addition, as necessary and as needed, mitigation measures will be included, which are intended to reduce significant impacts to ideally below threshold levels where feasible, but impacts that can't be eliminated or mitigated to less than significant levels will also be identified as well. The EIR will also be discussing the project's alternatives, which will present and assess the potential environmental impacts of the alternatives analyzed in addition to implementation of the proposed project. So one of these alternatives will be a no project alternative, which assumes that the R3 project would not occur. And then there will be other project alternatives which are intended to reduce or eliminate any significant effects of the project that we find during the draft EIR process, while still achieving most of those basic project objectives. And lastly, the EIR will discuss other CEQA discussions, which identify spatial, economic, and population growth impacts that may result from the implementation of the proposed project, as well as long-term effects of the project and significant and irreversible environmental changes as a result. So again, this is a program EIR, so it's going to be looking at the impacts of the project citywide, and according to the CEQA guidelines, the EIR will focus on a series of connected actions that govern future activities and decisions rather than a specific development, project, or property. Next slide, Eric. So here is a high-level and pretty simplified timeline of the CEQA process to date. On July 9th, the city distributed an NOP, or a notice of preparation, that the draft, that the program EIR would be being prepared. That opens up the public review period for any comments that people might have. That closes on August 11th. From there, that allows us to really get started on the draft EIR, which we anticipate will hopefully be available for public review in late 2025. After which it opens up a 45-day review period for comments, again, on the adequacy of the draft EIR. So looking forwards towards early 2026 and spring 2026, a final EIR, which would incorporate the public comments and concerns raised during that 45-day comment period, would be prepared, and the project would be brought before council. So the last step that we would be looking at that point is adoption of the EIR in ideally late spring 2026. Alrighty, and so to kind of wrap it up, I just wanted to remind folks again that we are at the beginning of the process. We are just embarking on this analysis. What we want from the public is input on the scope of the document. So again, if there's a key environmental issue that you think should be considered, or an alternative or mitigation measure you'd like to see included, please feel free to provide that input now. But as I previously mentioned, the scoping meeting is not your only opportunity to provide comments in the EIR. You can submit written comments via email to Eric or via regular mail to the Planning Division with attention to Eric. But with either approach, please note that the deadline to submit comments is a hard deadline. It's August 11th at 5 p.m. Comments received after that may not be considered within the EIR. So with that, I think I will put it back over to Eric and we can open it up.
Thank you very much, Gianna. And just one more slide here with information about how you can stay updated on the project. It's our website, mountainview.gov/R3 zoning update. So thanks again, Gianna. We will, let me stop sharing. And if you want to raise your hand and ask a question or make a comment, we're here for you to help answer any questions or take your comments about this CEQA process. Okay, I see the first hand from Leslie Friedman. You should be able to talk.
I'm unmuting.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. One is that I was unhappy to discover that Governor Newsom wanted to do away with CEQA. And so to what extent is that affecting what you're working on? And or is there a sort of timing lag between using it now and not later? Go ahead and answer me, because I'll have another question, if I may. Thank you.
Sure. Great question. This happened very quickly and caught us all off guard. These series of bills that were adopted at the end of June, and we're still really digesting them. There's a lot of new information that we need to understand and kind of fit in with our processes. What I will say is that there has been no action to change the CEQA process for these types of legislative actions. So when the city does a rezoning or a general plan amendment, we are still required to go through the California Environmental Quality Act process. Just to speak a very high level and with what little information I have about recent bills, they are targeted more towards housing element implementation actions, which this is, while there's a portion of that this project has, it's primarily not a housing element implementation action, and as well as new CEQA exemptions and procedures for residential development projects. And again, this is a specifically residential development projects that comply with zoning. So this is a zoning change, general plan amendment, legislative changes to the zoning. And so they wouldn't apply to any of those recent statutes. I will say that, the state is always moving on this issue and always moving very fast, and we're trying very hard to catch up and stay on top of what they do, but it's often very hard to anticipate their actions. And so I don't know what else Governor Newsom is going to do, but we're going to move forward as we are required right now.
Okay, thank you very much. May I ask another question?
Absolutely, feel free.
Great. There have been two city council member votes. I assume that the second one is what's holding forth. I don't really know. There, in February, or maybe it was March, there was a sequence of council members voting on where these new R3s would be in the city. Mm-hmm. And I think I wasn't at the meeting the whole time. They have very long meetings. That some of the areas which are predominantly single family dwellings, at that first go around, I believe that they were thinking they were not going to demolish the dwellings or sell them to develop bigger things. Where I live, there are some single family dwellings, but they also have multifamily buildings behind a couple of places. It's normal. However, it seems to me that the vote that happened, maybe it was June, changed all of that. At least I think it changed all of that. That different areas were going to be changed to R3 than were taken that way the months before that. So I'm wishing I could get a better idea of what the goal is. What is the goal of changing the zoning? That's what I'm curious about. I think it's important. Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you asking it in that way. It's good to understand the goals of the project, and I'm happy to share them with you. First off, let me just kind of clarify the decision-making process that happened this year with the City Council. I'm going to share my screen and go back to that map of the new R3 districts. So back in March, the council provided initial direction on where to increase densities. And they did focus on, again, these R3B, C, and D zones were already R3. So they're not taking previously R1 areas or R2 areas. They are taking R3 areas and changing the densities in those R3 areas. The R3A zone is an increase in density from the R2 zone, and that applies to certain parts of the R2 zone, which is typically duplexes, but there are some single families in that homes in that zone. And this is based on the housing element program. But again, the council direction from March was to identify areas to upzone to these R3D1 and R3D2 areas, the 50 to 75 and the 75 to 110. Again, take existing R3 areas and see where to increase them from 25 or 35 to these densities. And back in March, they identified all of the red areas. And they also said some of these dark red areas should still be the medium red, so the 50 to 75. So this one specifically, the direction was to be the medium red, and this area here, the direction was to be the medium red. Now in June, council provided additional direction and requested that the project include this area along Rengstorff and California Street and Latham Street, should go to dark red, should go to the 75 to 110. And this area along California Street on either side of Ortega Avenue should also go up to 75 to 110. And that was the only direction that was given in June. That was the only change to the project at that time. So that's the, and also just to clarify something else that I think you said, there is no council mandate that single family homes be sold or redeveloped here. This is simply a change in the regulations that provides more options for property owners to add density on their properties. And so what are the goals of the project? Well, that's a great question. There are several goals of the project. The first, as I said, is to identify additional housing opportunities, additional development opportunities for housing. Part of that is to provide more opportunities for different types of housing. For example, affordable housing, housing that might serve different sized families or different age groups. Another goal is to improve access to neighborhood goods and services by allowing some small neighborhood commercial. Another goal is to bring us into full compliance with the with state laws, as they've been changing a lot in the last few years. And those are the primary goals of the project, and we're going to be implementing all of those goals in the coming months as we're drafting the plan and the EIR.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for your question. It was a great question. Do we have any more questions or comments?
Eric, it looks like maybe there's one in the Q&A chat from Graham.
Oh, is there? Okay, thank you. Hello, Alex. Can you make it clear whether eminent domain forcing residents from homes is something that is possible under this plan? No, that is not something that's being contemplated under the plan, but thank you very much for the question. All right, well, thank you again for your questions and for your interest in this project. As a reminder, oh, we have another question. Okay, Graham, I will allow you to talk. Go ahead, you should be able to unmute and speak.
Hey, hi, can you hear me?
I can.
So my other question, and we were at a previous meeting, even though our house isn't in the zone, it's just one block different. This was a specific site plan, one of the specific site plans on Moffett. And
Mhm.
so one thing I'm concerned about with the environmental um, impact is the fact that um, a resident can be in an area where all of a sudden they'll have a six-story building where, they had a clear a clear line of sight and it's all like
Mhm.
one-story buildings. And now they can have like a six-story building like right on, a one block away from them or half a block away from them. Yet they're not notified or included or they're not notified that there's an impact to them because the zoning isn't changing on their block. And I was wondering if maybe the process of notification could change, or if you could comment on that and what you think about that. And yeah.
Well, that's a great question. We have our required noticing, which does not actually include postcards for a project of this scale. We do, however, send postcards. We sent postcards to, I don't recall exactly how many people, but tens of thousands of addresses in the vicinity of affected R3 areas when we went to council in last March. And we have sent postcards to the whole city for earlier outreach meetings, just to make sure that people are aware that this is a project that's going on. We've done other noticing and events and flyers and things like that just to get the word out. Um, then when a project comes through, it depends on the level of review that happens with the project, but it's possible that there may be required noticing with the project. And that could include a sign at the site, for example, or setting up or mailings, postcards as well. So that's our noticing policies. If you have comments on that or would like to change our noticing policies, we can you can send me an email, and I can talk about the best ways to provide that kind of input.
Okay, thanks. So you understand the concern I'm talking about, but
I do.
that's fine.
Yeah.
I'm good. Thanks very much for the meeting and answering my question.
Of course. Thank you for coming. It looks like David Watson raised his hand. Go ahead.
Could you bring up the map again?
Yes.
Oh man, that's I can zoom. Look at that. What a deal. Okay, so the thing I was going to ask about was it really seems like R3 is what like six or five different it's a lot of different zones are all R3, and that feels unnecessarily complicated to me. I'm wondering if you've considered combining at least a couple of these into single zones. And then the other item I was going to ask about was given the other commenters suggestion about nearby properties, have you I maybe this was discussed before. I think that there are setbacks at the property edges, but whether there are or not, it would maybe simplify things to raise the nearby zones if things are actually changing. So raise the whatever the next plot over is, instead of pushing the R3 down, allow the neighboring part of the neighboring property to go up. That's my suggestion there.
Okay. Well, thank you for the comment on the latter. We'll take that down. And then you had a question about whether we've considered kind of simplifying the zoning, maybe having fewer districts. I think at this point we've received our council direction on the densities. However, one of the goals of the of the form-based code that we're working on right now is to kind of look at zoning from a perspective of building types, and that does have the potential to simplify
Sure. Absolutely.
the categories of codes and the different kind of levels of kind of complexity.
I absolutely appreciate that. I mean, I guess the fact that we're talking about form-based zoning and like the label on the map is not in terms of the form; it's in terms of the use, right? That's kind of what I'm. I guess that's my sort of commentary on that. Again, I'm happy that you're attempting to simplify it, and I appreciate that. But it's considering that you're still talking about the zones in terms of the use, it sort of indicates that like there clearly is room to improve on that.
Absolutely. Again, great comment. And I think that's certainly something that we're seeking to do as part of the code. What I will say is that the number of units is integral to the CEQA analysis and the EIR analysis that we have to do, which is why we're focusing. We were focusing on these numbers before with council, just so that we could get started on this process, as well as focusing on it in this meeting. But it's a great reminder that that's one of the goals of our code structure, is to keep it simple.
All right, I'm so sorry. I think that there are questions in the Q&A now also maybe, but the one other thing I was going to ask, I'm so sorry, is maybe you even got this earlier, but state law changed regarding CEQA analysis of changes to housing elements. Did you talk about that already and I didn't join in time for that?
I mentioned it briefly, yes. So implementation of housing elements is now not required to go through separate CEQA analysis. These density increases were not contemplated in our housing.
Okay. So so you're saying that the process here does still require CEQA analysis, even though it's like a sub part of the housing. It's like, okay, sure, weird if you say so.
I can step in a little bit and give a little bit more background. So the new regulations that were set forth require the project to fit within the whole to be exempt. There are portions of the R3 project that do fit within those new regulations, which would be exempt, but there are portions that would not. So what that requires is us to go forward with an EIR, because if we were to just look at the parts that do under an exemption and the parts that don't under something else, that runs us into the risk of what's called piecemealing, which is no longer following CEQA guidelines. So as Eric mentioned, the project itself would still be required to abide by an EIR because it as a whole fits within the guidelines therein.
Thank you for clarifying, Gianna. That's a great clarification. Thank you. So I'm going to jump to some comments in the Q&A. I think the next comment in the Q&A is, will we still have the opportunity to improve the zoning in the rest of the city's R3 parcels, make them all R3D? So at this point, council has given direction on what the densities they want to study in this EIR. If they do indicate that they want to change any of the densities for the final project, we will have to do some analysis to see how consistent that is with the analysis that's done in the EIR. In general, a larger scope is generally studied in the EIR because in most cases and for most topics, it's easier to scale back than it is to ramp up. So there was a lot of discussion at the council, both in March as well as June, about the pros and cons of identifying more areas for increasing densities. And so this is where council ended up, and this is what we're going to be studying. The next question is, does CEQA allow us to explore the opportunity costs of delayed densification? Um, no, because that is well, let me see what you mean by that. I think you mean, for example, if a property isn't densified, then maybe some of the environmental benefits that might happen from that densification would not happen, and therefore we would analyze that under CEQA. I have never seen that mode of analysis in an environmental document. Gianna, can you speak to that at all? It seems fairly um, like a guess about the future that I don't think we could rigorously analyze in a document like an EIR.
Yeah, so looking forward towards future projects and what may or may not occur it's a tricky thing. So CEQA does require us to think future to an extent, but it's not necessarily looking at what would or wouldn't occur because of delay of the project. As I mentioned previously, it does consider the spatial, economic, and cumulative impacts of the project. So that is where we kind of tread into that territory of considering, what may or may not occur, but it's not necessarily looking at the cost per se of what would or would not happen. It's mostly focused on the impacts of the actual project, not what the project would not achieve, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Gianna. Great perspective. Next question. Before the project is brought to City Council, will it go through other review groups like the Environmental Planning Commission? Yes. Under our city charter, we are required to take zoning and general plan amendments to the EPC for recommendation before they go to the City Council. And then we have another question here. Every few years, each R3 parcel becomes the greater of it and its adjacent parcel subdistricts. This sounds like a procedural idea for increasing density across the city in a maybe a kind of automatic way, or a way that will kind of contemplate density opportunities contiguous with existing dense areas. It's an interesting idea. I think it does kind of fundamentally change the legislative nature of zoning. Those actions would need to be enacted by a legislative body like a city council. But it's a great note, and we will take it down, and we can look at it through the process. Okay. It doesn't seem like we have any more hands up in the attendee list or questions in the Q&A. I'll give you all another maybe 2 minutes to about 7:50 to see if anything else sparks your mind that you may want to ask or comment on. In the meantime, I'll bring back up the how to comment slide. And I do want to say that we are giving folks an extra couple days from what was actually in the NOP you might have received. So the NOP said August 8th. We are giving folks until August 11th. So if you don't make August 8th, you're in luck. Got a thank you in the Q&A. Well, thank you very much for coming. Appreciate you coming out. All right. Well, I guess we will sign off then at 7:50. Thank you all again. And really appreciate your questions and comments. And if you have more comments, please send them to me by August 11th. Thanks again to Cecilia and Gianna for your help this evening, and to everyone for coming out.